There would seem to be some loss of a freedom possibly with this, that there may be some level of reasonable privacy even on a public street, where if somebody follows me too long, I can go ahead and file a court order saying this guy is bugging the tarnation out of me, and yet I was on a public street. So there may be some loss of freedom. Is that something that you would admit to, Karen?
Well, actually that was important to us in crafting the proposition, and the proposition says that the cameras must be conspicuous and shall only capture images that can be seen from public places where there is no reasonable expectation of privacy. So we're not talking about hiding these cameras away in areas that have a reasonable expectation of privacy. And the other thing to note is the ordinance says that the recordings will only be kept for 60 days unless there's an ongoing criminal investigation. And at that point, then they would be recorded over and used. Now, we have to think about what's reasonable. The police are not going to be sitting there watching these cameras 24/7. There's not the resources to do that, nor is it practical. They'll only be used in a case such as Adam's incident, where they come forward and they are just incredibly valuable to the law enforcement as another tool.
But you know, one of the fundamental differences between private and public cameras is the images produced by public government-owned cameras are subject to the state sunshine law. That means that anyone who requests copies of those recordings must receive them. That is a matter of law. And I want to point out in the city staff's analysis of this ordinance, it refers to the various alleged restrictions on the availability, that they should only be available to the private contractor the city works with and to criminal justice and people authorized. And immediately following, the city attorney says this provision would be in conflict with the state sunshine law. That's absolutely right. There are provisions in this ordinance which have already been, in the opinion of our city attorney, found to be unconstitutional, or not unconstitutional necessarily, but illegal under state law. Some of these alleged protections simply are not going to hold up. And the idea that anyone who wants to obtain copies of these can do so for any reason whatsoever should cause everyone to have some misgivings about this. I also want to address the point that the ordinance does indeed require that the cameras be placed in conspicuous locations. If anyone remembers seeing the cameras that were on Broadway briefly last year, they are indeed conspicuous. They are ugly. They are intended to instill fear and intimidation into citizens who see them. And the fact that these cameras must, under the ordinance, be made conspicuous, I believe is going to give exactly the opposite impression from what the proponents hope they'll do. They're not going to make people feel safer. They're going to make people feel like this must be some kind of a high crime district, or else why would we have these very conspicuous cameras all over?
Karen addressed that, and then pitch it back to me, and I'd like to bring up again the sunshine law.
Well, and that's what I wanted to address really, was the sunshine law. First of all, you're right, they do fall under the sunshine law, as do all of those city cameras that are there today. The cameras that caught the attack on Adam are under the sunshine law. And my understanding about the sunshine law is that when someone requests it, then they are obligated to pay the expense of pulling the video and the staff time, and so there would be some cost involved in that. So, you know, those cameras that are there today in the parking garages in City Hall are under the sunshine law today. So I don't see a whole lot of difference on these additional cameras. Now, when you talk about the cameras on Broadway, I do want to point out that the ordinance was written that the deployment of the cameras will be at the discretion of the police chief to deploy them. And we aren't saying that they're mobile units. We're not saying that they're the units that were even tried last year. We want a recommendation from the chief on the best tools that will aid his unit.
You know, if I could address that, it brings up a point that has not been discussed, to my knowledge, at all in this debate. That is that the form of this ordinance sets a very dangerous precedent. It declares that a city department head will have the authority to overrule the elected city council, indeed to overrule the city manager chosen by the elected city council. It gives direct authority to a city department head to do as he sees fit, regardless of what the elected leaders of our community think. And that is not the way we normally run city government. That is a radical departure from the way that our city government normally operates, and it is unprecedented.
We talk about being watched, the big brother. We're watched right now in the parking garages. I didn't realize until this past week that we have cameras on the lapel or area thereof of our police officers downtown. Is that weird you guys out at all that those are there?
Well, I'm concerned about that, but not as concerned
Karen
about...
doesn't have anything to hide. I got a few things to hide out there.
You You know, that idea that if you don't have anything to hide, you shouldn't object to being on camera 24/7 seems to be kind of a product of this reality TV mentality that I think people are falling into these days. You know, there is just a simple concept of human dignity that requires that we have some independence, some freedom, some personal space, that we have control over our immediate environment. And if that is violated when the government puts us under constant surveillance.
You know, it's interesting to bring up the phrase human dignity, because I think that's probably within both of your positions. Wouldn't that be true?
I believe so.
You know, you mentioned, go ahead, Tim.
Well, I was going to say, I in no way, obviously, would defend, nor would the ACLU or our allies defend the actions of the criminals who assaulted Adam Taylor. I'm a criminal defense lawyer, but I choose not to represent people who are charged with offenses of that nature. I feel very strongly about stopping violence, but I also feel very strongly about the need to preserve the precious civil liberties that we still have, and they have been eroded dramatically in recent years. This is another brick in the wall. This is another step that the government's taking to take away that which is most precious about our being Americans, our personal liberty. The fact that our emails and the privacy of our electronic communications were violated by the federal government a few years back, and probably continue to be, that our telephonic communications are likewise being violated by the federal government, that our local police department and sheriff department, without any public discussion or debate, are implementing a program which will use roving surveillance scanners on police vehicles to record the whereabouts of every motor vehicle within view. And these are capable of recording virtually any license plate that's anywhere within the perimeter of the area visible to any police car. That'll keep not a permanent perhaps, but a database of where we all are at all times of the day. And this government surveillance has just gone overboard.
Karen?
You know, I've said this before, and I'll repeat it, but in a perfect world, I wouldn't want cameras either. But we don't live in that world, and I know that firsthand. You know, I've watched crime, I read it in the paper for a long time. And in fact, I'm ashamed to say, but until it happened to my own family, I thought, well, isn't that too bad? But then it did happen to my family. And I know that if it happens to mine, it can happen to anybody. And so when I look at that, I think, you know, I don't really like going through airport security either, but I do, because it allows me to be safer on an airplane. And so I do believe that sometimes safety has to trump. And that's what I believe in this case.